On October 18, 1955, the naked bodies of Robert Peterson, John Schussler, and Anton Schussler were found in a ditch. The case changed everyone's lives for good. The search for answers was intense, but justice seemed like an impossible dream after the case went cold for almost 40 years. Who could have done something so terrible to two Nave boys? How did they stay away from the law for so long? Hi, and welcome back to our channel. If you are new here, please consider subscribing, as it helps us motivate to create more intriguing content for you. Let's have a look at the most chilling case you've ever heard, the case of Kenneth Hansen. In the 1950s, Chicago discovered the hidden gem on the northwest side. Norwood Park and Jefferson Park were safe places for people who wanted to get away from the chaos of life in the city. The church, the Little League, and the bowling hall were the centers of the close-knit community. It was a great place to raise a family because it had the lowest crime rate in the city. In 1955, a terrible event shook this town. Robert Bobby Peterson was born on February 11, 1942, in Cook County, Chicago. He was the first child of Malcolm and Dorothy Peterson. Even as a child, Robert was known for being neat and organized. He was a responsible young man who helped out at home and took part in many activities in the neighborhood. Anton Schussler Sr. and Eleanor Lillian Holtz Schussler had John Schussler on November 30, 1941. John loved sports from a young age. He was also a great kid who never got into trouble. Anton John Schussler, or Tony, his brother, was born on November 12, 1943, which was 2 years after he was. He knew from a very young age that he wanted to become a vet. They were always together and did everything together. As the sun went down on the quiet streets where John, Anton, and Robert had spent their childhoods playing sports and exploring their neighborhood, there was a sense of something dark and dangerous in the air. It looked like something bad was about to happen. On October 16, 1955, a cool autumn day in Chicago, two young boys, John and Anton, got on their bikes and rode over to the house of their friend Robert. Since their father was not feeling well, they had already helped him hang a clothesline in the basement, so they had the day to themselves. John and Anton each had $1.25 in cash that was burning a hole in their pockets, and they had a bold plan to sneak downtown and see a movie. The boys were not allowed to go on the dangerous trip, but their 14-year-old friend Robert was the expert, so he was allowed to go. John Schussler, his brother Anton, and their friend Robert Peterson went to the Loop Theater to see The African Lion by Walt Disney. With $1.50 in his hand, Robert said goodbye to his parents, kissed them, and left the house, promising to be back by 8 o'clock. As the night got darker and the clock passed 8, both families started to worry. No one saw or heard from the boys, and no one called. Eleanor, John, and Anton's mom all called the Peterson house to find out how the boys were doing. Eleanor was surprised when Robert's mother, Dorothy, told her they were going downtown. When the boys did not call, Dorothy Peterson called the police at the Gale Street station around 10 p.m. because she was getting more and more worried. She talked to Sergeant Petz, who told the families to call back if the boys did not come back in an hour. When the boys started their trip, the sky was a beautiful blue color, but as the day went on, the weather got worse. The stormy night brought heavy rain, which made the neighborhood even more worried. Even though it was hard, Mr. Peterson and Mr. Schussler did not give up looking for their lost boys. They went to every burger place on Milwaukee Avenue and even checked the Loop Theater, where the boys were going to see a movie. But nothing came of all their work. The boys seemed to have just disappeared. It was clear that calling the cops was the only way out. The Peterson and Schussler families had never really met or talked to each other, even though their kids went to the same school and were friends. It was like their lives were going in the same direction, but never crossed. They had no idea that their lives were about to become deeply connected in ways they could never have dreamed. As the cops started looking for the missing boys, they asked the boys' parents about their clothes and belongings to see if they could find any clues. They found out that Robert was wearing a White Sox jacket while the other boys wore Cubs jackets. Where might they be? It would take an hour to drive to downtown, so it did not seem likely that they could have gone that far. After spending their money on snacks, They were walking home in the rain. Or maybe they went bowling, which was one of the boys' favorite things to do. On October 17, 1955, as the sun rose, the day after the boys' disappearance, an even greater sense of unease gripped the town. The cops were also confused because they had never had a case in that area where a missing child did not turn up. Even though Robert had skipped school before, everyone knew that he was a responsible person who would never leave Anton and John alone. The detectives chose to check out the boys' school, Farnsworth School on Linder Avenue, to see if the disappearance had anything to do with it. Principal D. Dewey Thornton suggested that they check the north branch of the Chicago River in the Forest Preserve because it was a place where violence had happened in the past. A year before the boys went missing, a high school boy attacked a fifth grader near the river. Mrs. Bernice Jonas and Miss Cecilia Schwachten, who taught the boys, were upset and tried to keep their cool. Mrs. Jonas thought that in the last few days, one or two guys might have been trying to get the attention of the students. Some students said that the community was full of fear, and the agents knew that if they did not find the boys soon, rumors and speculations would make it hard to figure out what happened. With 60,000 people in the area, the officers had their work cut out for them. They had to ring a lot of doorbells and cover a large area. They knew they had to cut down the number of places they were looking to increase their chances of success. So they started by looking at the Loop Theater and calling the bus drivers who were working the day the boys went missing. One driver, Bruno Mansorini, had an important lead. He remembered seeing the boys, who looked like Robert, John, and Anton, get on his bus at Berto Avenue and show student ID cards. They were going to bowl at the Jefferson Park recreation alleys, so he dropped them off on Lawrence Avenue. The trouble was that they had not asked for a transfer slip, which meant they should have gotten off at Central, near the Peterson home. Maybe that simple change in plans set off a terrifying chain of events. It seemed like the police were finally making some headway in their search for the boys who had gone missing. Sightings at the bowling alley gave the next important piece of information. Neighbors and family members of the boys said they had seen Robert and Anton at Monte Cristo Bowling Alley. They were going to the bathroom while John was talking to a neighbor. After Robert and Anton came back from the bathroom at 8 o'clock, the boys left. Edward C. Davis, the manager of the bowling hall, added to the mix by saying that the boys had been there twice that day, once at 3:15 p.m. and again at 7 p.m. Because they did not have enough money, they had not gone bowling. It made people wonder how three young boys ended up back at the same place just hours after being turned away. Why would they come back if they did not have any cash to bowl? Now that the detectives had a schedule, it was up to them to put the rest of the puzzle together. But they still did not know everything about what had happened. Knowing that they were so close to the boys but still could not find them was upsetting. On October 18, 1955, Russell Corcoran, captain of the 33rd Precinct of the Chicago Police Department, was working in a tense and busy office. The lost Peterson and Schussler boys had taken over the whole department, and the captain had just told the commissioner that they were doing everything they could to find them. But at 1:15, the phone rang again, and when the captain picked it up, he thought it was just another normal call. But as he listened, his face turned pale and tears came to his eyes. After the captain hung up the phone, he said something terrible that would haunt the police team for the rest of their lives. 3 young boys' bodies were found with nothing on them. Victor Livingston, a middle-aged liquor seller, was driving around in his car and enjoying the results of his hard work. He had made a lot of money and wanted to have lunch somewhere quiet. So he got in his car and drove to Robinson Woods Forest Preserve, a beautiful place on the northwest side of Chicago where people go to see birds and fall colors. But he had no idea that he was about to find something very scary. As he was about to eat, he was sitting in his car when he saw a person lying still on the ground. He drove away quickly to find a phone so he could call the cops. Since the bodies were dumped in a ditch that was 2 feet deep, only one could be seen. The detectives looked everywhere for the lost boys, but what they found was much scarier than anyone could have expected. Just 2 weeks before Halloween, the boys were found naked and piled on top of each other. Robert's head had a horrible wound that had been there for a long time and had healed. Even worse, the area was already dirty, so there was no chance of finding tracks or anything else that could help. 3 boys were found dead in the Robinson Woods Forest Preserve. An autopsy showed that they had been dead for at least 36 to 40 hours before they were found. At first, people thought that the boys had been hurt, but the autopsy proved that was not the case. But Dr. Harry R. Hoffman, who works at the Cook County Behavior Clinic, said grimly that the person who did such a terrible thing was probably satisfying their needs by doing it. Dr. Jerry Kearns was an expert at looking at dead bodies, but he did not bring the seriousness of his job with him. The story of the Schussler-Peterson boys, on the other hand, would be hard to forget. Anton Jr. had gotten a karate chop to the neck. Fingernail marks on Anton and John's necks, on the other hand, showed that they had been choked. The Schussler boys seemed to have been choked with their bare hands, but it looked like a rope was used to strangle Robert. He had also been hit in the head 14 times with what looked like a rake or a farming tool. The other boys had been hit in the face with what looked like the flat side of a knife. Coroner Walter E. McCarrow also had something to say about the tragedy. He said that it was the work of a madman and possibly a group of older boys. It was said that Robert, John, and Anton were probably held captive in a dirty place, bound and tied with strips of tape, and then dumped in a forest preserve. Dr. Kearns knew this was not a normal case. The killer struck from the left back, and even though it looked like a terrible crime, there was no sign of an attack. Robert had to fight for his life, and his head wounds showed that he had. Even a witness said the car was a Packard, which led police to talk to almost 1,000 people who owned Packards. Even after a long investigation in which more than 43,000 people were questioned, the killer could not be found. Anton Schussler Sr., who had just lost his 2 sons, spoke out about the tragedy. He expressed concern that when children couldn't go to the movies in the afternoon and return home safely, something was wrong with the country. But the Schussler family's bad luck was not over yet. Anton Sr. died of a heart attack just 1 month after the killings. He was only 41 years old. Eleanor Schussler's life became even lonelier than it had been before. Both of her sons and her husband had died. She married Valentine Bud Kujawa as time went on and tried to move on with her life. But she never forgot about the killings. She always had a photo of the boys and their bronzed baby shoes on her dresser to remember her of the children she would lose. She lived for decades with the haunting question of what had happened to her boys, and when detectives came to visit, it was a painful reminder of the unsolved case. Gary Kujawa, who is her stepson, remembers how much the murders hurt her and said that she always thought about the tragedy. The Peterson family also had trouble getting through their grief. Malcolm lost both his son and his best friend at the same time. The tragedy made Dorothy, Robert's mother, so weak that she needed medical care. In the months after the killings, Chicago was a strange place. Officers searched the streets for hours, looking for any sign of proof or even a piece of the boys' clothes. Parents were afraid to let their kids out of their sight for fear that the unknown attackers would also hurt them. Now they could not even imagine leaving their kids at home alone. Doors were locked tight, and putting things in the trash seemed like a risky move because anything suspicious could lead to a lot of questioning by the cops who were looking into it. Terror had spread to every part of life, leaving the town paralyzed with fear. Even though there was a lot of chaos, the investigation continued with hundreds of uniformed police officers and investigators in plain clothes going through the neighborhood. Captain Luis Caparelli called in an extra 200 cops from his team, and all of them gave up their weekend plans to help find the person. One police officer in the Chicago Police Department remarked that they had never witnessed anything like it before. But it was not until December 7, 1955, that the Chicago Daily News paid attention to some strange marks on John's left thigh, halfway between his knees and hip. The marks were circular and 4 inches by 2 inches. They were made on the fatty layer of tissue under the skin in the shape of a pattern of stars and letters. The word bear stood out the most because Dr. Kearns had missed this point in his early research. The workers at the funeral home found shocking bone breaks in the Schussler boys that Dr. Kearns had missed. Another important piece of evidence was that the boys' faces had been covered with tape, but they had been taken off before the bodies were put in the ditch. Coroner McCarran said that the people who did this crime knew what they were doing. They were careful to take off the tape that had been used to bind and mute the victims. The leads that seemed so hopeful at first slowly went away, and the once busy investigation turned into a quiet, unmoving cold case. The brutal killings of 3 young boys in Chicago left detectives with more questions than answers. On Friday, December 28, 1956, 2 teenage girls, Barbara Grimes, 15, and Patricia Grimes, 13, went missing after watching their favorite movie, Love Me Tender. They left the house around 6:30 p.m. This was another tragedy. They would take a bus to get to the movie house, which was down Archer Avenue. So they went to the Brighton Theater to see Elvis Presley's Love Me Tender. Their bodies were found naked on the side of the road, just like the bodies of the other people who had been killed. But unlike with the boys, there was no clear reason why she died. The coroner's jury decided that the girls died because they got too cold. According to the coroner, the official cause of death was simply secondary shock from the cold. They were not in a normal position, like 2 people who had frozen to death and just fell asleep. But the main detective, Harry Gloss, did not agree. He thought that the fact that there was ice around the bodies showed that they were warm when they were left there, and that Patricia's chest wounds showed that she had been hurt before she died. He also thought Barbara had been hurt, which the doctors had said was not the case. People thought that the same person might have been behind both crimes because of how alike they were. It seemed like the murders of the boys in Chicago would stay a mystery forever. But then, in 1994, a bombshell fell, and it was not the kind of proof you see on TV crime shows. There was no DNA, no fingerprints, and no new proof that a forensics expert could find. Instead, it was a tip from a snitch in an investigation that had nothing to do with this case that suddenly led directly to a suspect in this long-dormant case. On February 17, 1977, when Special Agent Jim Grady and his partner, Mr. Retuno, started putting together clues from the horse racing industry, they made a big step forward in the case of the missing Candy Erickson and horsewoman Helen Voorhees Brock. They thought they knew who killed the horses and took Candy and Helen. They knew they were going into a place where there were secrets. As the parts of the puzzle started to fit together, the prosecution team found itself in a world of murderers, arsonists, swindlers, and con artists. As they dug deeper, they started hearing rumors that a guy named Kenneth Hansen had something to do with the boys' deaths. Hansen had told his close friends and family about the event. Pieces of information from this dark world were used to build the case many years. Somehow, they were able to make it all fit together, giving a clear picture of what had happened all those years ago. By the beginning of the 1990s, police were getting closer and closer to Kenneth Hansen. Kenneth Hansen was born in 1933 to Ethan and Lucille Hansen. His life was full of ups and downs. As a kid, he was known for being smart and charming. He later married his high school sweetheart, Beverly Ray Carlson, and had 2 sons, Danny and Mark. In the 1960s, he opened and ran a horse stable called Camelot near Tinley Park. Roger Spree moved into the Hansen house when he was 11 or 12 years old. He was a young worker at Hansen's riding stable. Friends of Spree's have said that Hansen was like a father to him. But that figure of a father would soon be shown to be something much worse. On March 29, 1994, Special Agent Jim Grady and his team, which included Mr. Retuno, confronted Kenneth Hansen with the proof against him. Hansen was 60 years old at the time, and as they laid out the case, he felt like the walls were closing in. Hansen decided to take a polygraph test as a way to work together. But Hansen died before the test could be done because he had a heart attack. He finally seemed to be getting what he deserved, but it was a bittersweet win. Even though Hansen did not say he did it, there was a lot of proof against him. People had come forward to say that Hansen was with the boys on the day they disappeared. The most likely person who killed Robert Peterson, John Schussler, and Anton Schussler was Kenneth Hansen. His death ended the investigation, and the case was formally over. But there were still some questions and doubts. Was Kenneth Hansen responsible for these brutal killings, or was there something else going on? The fact that Hansen died before he went to trial or confessed makes it hard to know what happened. Even so, the case is still one of the most disturbing and sad unanswered crimes in Chicago's history. Robert Peterson, John Schussler and Anton Schussler's families will always feel sad about losing their loved ones, and the rest of the community will always remember how dark their neighborhood became in 1955. What do you think of this case? Let us know in the comment section below. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to hit that subscribe button before you go. Thanks for watching.